"Out of here! Now!" The words snapped through the air like a slap. The owner's hand didn't wait for permission. It shoved forward with a jolt, catching the old man just beneath the collarbone. Benjamin Carter, 85, stumbled back half a step. His cane, always gripped with steady, practiced hands, skittered across the tile, striking a metal shelf with a hollow clang. A single apple rolled off a display nearby, circling slowly in the silence that followed. Ben didn't fall, but something about the way he tilted, slow, reluctant, like a tree being asked to bow, told everyone watching that he almost did. The store's noise had died instantly. The hum of the freezers, the flicker of fluorescent bulbs. A toddler on aisle 2 went quiet in his mother's arms. The checker at the register froze, receipt tape still curled in one hand. The air was thick, stale with heat, and laced with the faint metallic scent of spilled coins. Ben's change had fallen with him, scattered like brass shrapnel at his feet. His hand hovered in the air, searching, not for anger, not even to push back, but for balance, dignity. The muscles in his jaw clenched tight. His mouth was closed. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of an old olive cap, didn't lift from the tile. No apology came. Only the sound of the owner's breath, sharp and still rising, and the self-righteous huff of someone who thought himself the king of a small castle. The tension lingered, heavy, unchecked. Then, the soft chime of the front doorbell. Boots stepped in from sunlight, and the owner's smirk cracked just slightly as a voice from the back of the store whispered to no one in particular. He shouldn't have done that. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Benjamin Carter stood beneath the flickering light panels of Donley's Market at exactly 8:42 a.m., as he had every morning for the past 7 years. His entrance was slow but not fragile, deliberate, measured, and grounded. He leaned heavier on his cane this morning. The rain 2 days ago had stirred something in the joints of his right hip, the same one he broke landing hard during a training exercise in '52. He didn't complain, just adjusted the angle of his step, like a man who had learned long ago that pain could be walked through, quietly and without a sound. The morning sun still clung to his shoulders. It gave his olive-green field jacket a soft golden hue. The patch on the arm, a faded anchor stitched into weathered cloth, had been washed so many times it looked like it belonged to the coat more than the man. His cap was pulled low, shielding most of his silver brows, but not the deep creases around his eyes. Those lines had seen deserts and oceans, and somehow still softened when he reached the counter and laid his morning bills down, flat and exact. "Bread, post, and those apple things, if you still got 'em," he said. He spoke softly, as if he didn't want to be a burden to the silence. The clerk didn't answer, barely looked up from his phone. Ben waited a few seconds, then began his slow path to the far end of the store, where the bread rack waited near the cooler. His steps were timed with the tap of his cane, rubber tip against tile, tap, tap, followed by a subtle breath. The rhythm was its own sort of reverence. He walked like a man still moving through old routines, each step echoing decades of discipline few could see. The store was nothing special. Stained floor tiles, fluorescent lights that buzzed louder than the customers, and a faint smell of plastic wrap and citrus cleaner. But for Ben, it was part of his ritual, a small tether to order in a world that often moved too fast. He always arrived before 9. He always picked the same loaf. He always read the headlines before paying, even if the print barely made sense to his tired eyes. Behind the counter, the store owner, a man in his 40s with tired skin and sharper eyes, leaned against the cigarette shelf and drummed his fingers on the scanner. He stared as Ben passed. Not rude, not warm, just the simmer of impatience, like someone who thought he deserved to run a place better than the one he owned. That morning, something about the air felt tighter. The way the man's jaw shifted when Ben reached for the bread, the way his eyes narrowed, as though waiting for a reason. Ben didn't notice, or if he did, He chose not to respond. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket with both hands, lining the buttons with practiced precision. He paused at the freezer, opened the glass door, and retrieved the same apple turnovers he always chose. His fingers trembled slightly as he set them into his basket, but his hands were steady when he closed the door behind him. It wasn't just age. It was memory. The weight of mornings that used to start with formation calls, boots snapping on cold concrete, steam rising from poured coffee in tin cups. That part of him never really left. It lived in the way he straightened each item in the basket before walking toward the counter. Not for neatness, for respect. Because everything had a place, and so did he. The store owner sighed, louder this time, as Ben reached the register. The receipt printer had jammed earlier. The scanner was dirty, nothing major. But in his world, everything was someone else's fault. And that morning, the only other person in his world was Ben Carter. A slow, quiet man who hadn't done anything wrong, except be old in a place that didn't value old anymore. Ben stood with quiet posture, waiting. His eyes drifted toward the open window, where sunlight landed on the rusted newspaper bin outside. The same copy from yesterday was still tucked behind the glass. His jaw worked slightly, not in irritation but in recognition. A small sigh escaped his nose. He adjusted his cap. He didn't know it yet, but this morning would be the last time he'd do this routine without interruption. The hum of the refrigeration unit in the back of the store grew louder as Ben turned from the counter and made his way toward the dairy section. He moved slowly, each step precise, the tip of his cane clicking gently against the worn linoleum tiles. Behind him, a small chime from the automatic door echoed softly. Someone else entering, though Ben didn't turn to see. He had a carton of milk to retrieve, and that task took all of his focus. The shelf before him was stacked neatly, bottles and cartons lined up like soldiers on parade. He scanned the labels, looking for the red cap he always chose. His fingers moved toward it, but not before a younger hand reached in front of him and snatched the last one from the rack. The teen didn't look at him, just walked away, earbuds in, hoodie up. Ben paused, hand suspended midair, then quietly reached for the second best choice. No complaint, just adaptation. He placed the milk in his wire basket, adjusting the turnovers so nothing was crushed. His fingers were slow to release the handle. A small cramp gripped the knuckles of his right hand, but he masked the wince by adjusting his jacket cuff. "Pride doesn't limp," he once told a younger sailor. "It walks slower, sure, but it still walks tall." He turned to begin the short journey back toward the register. It wasn't far, maybe 20 feet, but his path was blocked now by a yellow mop bucket and a sullen-faced stock boy refilling the gum rack. The boy didn't move. He glanced once at Ben, then returned to his task, earbuds humming some tinny rhythm. Ben waited, not out of uncertainty, but respect. The moment passed. Still no movement. "Excuse me," Ben said softly. The boy shifted the bucket just enough for Ben to pass, but didn't acknowledge him otherwise. As Ben stepped around, the wheel of his cane snagged slightly on the mop handle, causing him to sway for a half-second. He caught himself barely, with a hand against the shelf. He steadied, righted the basket, and kept moving. From behind the register, the store owner muttered something under his breath, not loud enough to be clear, but loud enough to sting. Ben placed the milk beside the bread on the counter. His eyes didn't leave the arrangement. He adjusted the items until they sat squarely, side by side, each edge aligned. The small ritual wasn't for efficiency, it was for order, for dignity, even here, especially here. The owner took the items slowly, one at a time, scanning them with an exaggerated sigh. His eyes flicked to the clock, then to the line behind Ben. Two young men, talking loudly, impatient already. "You know," the owner said, voice sharp enough to cut. "Maybe come earlier next time, before the real rush starts." Ben blinked once, not surprised, not angry, just still. He picked up the small cup of applesauce from his basket and added it to the pile. He didn't respond. The silence was his armor. One of the young men behind him chuckled. "Takes him longer to shop than to fight a war, huh?" Laughter. Quick, thoughtless, unkind. Ben's shoulders didn't flinch, but the light in his eyes shifted, just slightly, a small, silent dimming. The register beeped. The scanner jammed. The owner slammed the side of it with his palm. Then, with no warning, he leaned across the counter and barked, "Out of the way, old man! You've had your time!" And then it happened. He reached out and shoved Ben's chest. Not with full force, not enough to cause injury, but enough to move him, enough to make him stumble, enough to send his cane clattering sideways onto the tile with a metallic snap that echoed across the store like a slap. The breath in the room changed. Ben gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright. The air inside the store went still. Even the hum of the refrigeration unit felt muted. The two young men behind him froze. The stock boy finally looked up. For a moment, everything paused. And just beyond the aisle, past the corner of the coffee station, a man in plain clothes, tall, clean-shaven, badge on his belt, stopped in mid-step and turned his head. Ben stood there, gripping the counter with both hands, one knee trembling beneath him. The force of the shove had not knocked him down, but the aftershock of it, the choice behind it, settled deeper than any bruise could. His cane lay on the floor behind him, just beyond reach. Its absence was a quiet insult, like a soldier without his stripes. The owner didn't apologize. He turned back to the register with a grunt, pretending to scan the last item while shaking his head. "If you can't stand on your own," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "maybe stay home." The young man behind Ben snickered again. Somebody check his tags. Might have expired in the Cold War. The checker paused, fingers hovering above the keyboard. She looked at Ben for the first time. Really looked. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but her gaze fell quickly. She turned away. Ben didn't respond. He was still holding the edge of the counter, spine straightening slowly, quietly. His breath came low through his nose. One hand reached behind him, searching the air like memory, but couldn't quite find the cane. Behind the chip rack, a boy of maybe 12 stood frozen, a bottle of orange soda in his hand. His eyes flicked between the old man and the owner, then to the cane. He shifted his feet, looked at his mother beside the magazine rack. She placed a hand on his shoulder and gave a slight shake of her head. No one moved. A single apple rolled across the floor, knocked loose earlier in the stumble. It made a dull thud as it bumped into a rack of candy bars. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. The store owner leaned on the counter now, speaking not to Ben, but at him. "I'm not a charity. You think you get a free pass because you're dressed like an antique. You hold up my line every morning." Ben glanced at the floor. His cane, the apple, the crumpled dollar bill he had dropped in the commotion, all resting where his pride once stood. He said nothing. A young man in a delivery uniform stepped forward from the back. He cleared his throat. "Hey, maybe cool it. He's not hurting anyone." The owner rounded on him. "You here to work or play social worker?" The delivery man hesitated, shrugged awkwardly, then backed off with a mumbled apology. Even his shoes squeaked guiltily as he turned. Ben took a breath, long and steady. He turned, slowly, legs tight with effort. He stepped toward the cane but didn't bend to pick it up yet. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded bill, worn and soft from years of reuse. He held it up gently and placed it on the counter, his hand shaking slightly as he released it. The store owner didn't touch the money. He smirked and turned away. "Cosplay Marines," one of the young men said to his friend under his breath. "Bet he just likes dressing up. Probably never even saw a day in the field." Ben's hand stopped mid-air, hovering just inches from the cane on the floor. The fingers curled, then opened. He bent, not quickly, not easily, but he bent. A small grunt came from his chest as he reached the ground and picked up the cane. The movement was slow, deliberate, and full of grace despite the stiffness. He straightened again and turned toward the door. But before he could take a step, the store owner called out behind him, mocking, final. "Next time try Amazon. They deliver to retirement homes. Ben stopped. 1 foot forward, shoulders squared, head lifting an inch higher. He didn't turn around. And that's when the voice from behind the aisle spoke. Louder this time. "Sir, is there a problem here?" The tone was low, but crisp. The kind of voice that cuts through more than noise. The store owner blinked. His smile faltered. Everyone in the room turned one by one. And there, between the stacked cereal boxes and the gum display, stood a man in a tan collared shirt, tucked into dark slacks, badge clipped to his belt, hand resting calmly near his side. The tension in the store shifted. Not broken. Not yet. But something had changed. Ben did not turn to face the voice behind him. He remained exactly where the last insult had left him. 1 foot forward, cane in hand, body still tall in spite of all that had pressed against it. His back was a line of history drawn straight, from shoulders to heels, unbroken. Only the breath that filled his chest hinted at the pressure inside. Slow, deep, pulled from a place older than memory. The owner of the store, now suddenly aware of the shift in atmosphere, adjusted his stance. His bravado flickered, just a breath offbeat now. He glanced toward the man who had spoken but said nothing. A rare silence from someone who usually filled a room with noise. Ben reached into the small pouch tied to the front of his belt. Leather worn smooth by habit. From it, he drew a nickel, a quarter, and 2 wrinkled dollar bills. He laid them on the counter beside the bread. His hands no longer trembled. Each movement was precise, intentional. He didn't ask for change. He didn't look for sympathy. He simply finished what he came to do. The checker at the register looked down at the payment, then up at the owner, then back again. Her hands hovered uncertainly, caught between protocol and conscience. But Ben didn't linger long enough to force a decision. He tapped his cane once on the tile, just a quiet knock, and turned to leave. The door was 5 paces away. 5 paces through a silence that used to be laughter. 5 paces through the air where voices had ridiculed, where eyes had looked away. 5 paces across a battlefield, invisible to most, but deeply understood by those who had ever stood alone in a room full of people. As he walked, his steps were deliberate. The cane moved in rhythm, 1-2, 1-2, like the slow beat of a funeral drum. His boots, cracked and polished from years of wear, made a sound softer than the tiles beneath them should allow. A sound like history trying not to intrude. By the entrance he stopped. His left hand reached out, not to push the door open yet, but to adjust his cap. The olive fabric had slipped slightly during the earlier confrontation. He realigned it over his brow, smoothed the curve at the edge with his thumb. That thumb bore the faint white scar of a shrapnel wound, decades old, but still present, a trace of something no one in the store would ever be asked to understand. He didn't speak. He didn't glare. He only turned his head slightly, just enough for the checker and the owner to see the profile of his jaw. It was strong, set, immovable. There was no fear in it, only patience. The door opened with a chime, soft, hesitant, and for a moment, the wind outside swirled in, carrying the scent of hot pavement and sun-warmed dust. It brushed across Ben's shoulder like a salute. The light caught the edge of his cane, reflecting upward in a silver streak, and then he stepped out. The bell echoed behind him. The door shut. Inside the store, no one spoke. The man near the back, the one whose badge had remained clipped to his belt, still hadn't moved. But his eyes had. They had followed every step, every gesture, and now they were focused fully on the man behind the counter, who, for once, had nothing to say. The checker exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though she hadn't realized she'd been holding it, and in the silence left behind, the sound of Ben's cane could still be heard, tapping gently on the sidewalk just beyond the glass. The door had barely finished its slow swing shut when the man near the end of the aisle finally moved. No announcement, no sudden display of authority, just a shift of weight, from one boot to the other, as though the ground itself was asking him to rise. He stepped forward, Not fast. Just steady, as if he had already measured the distance between himself and the counter and chosen exactly when he would arrive. His frame was broad beneath a plain button-down shirt. His jeans bore the creases of use, not fashion. And though no uniform marked him out, the weight on his right hip, concealed but not hidden, spoke of service, of duty, of someone who had not only enforced the law but believed in it. His eyes, steel-colored and steady, were already set on the store owner. Not hard, not accusing, just aware, like someone reading a report they'd seen too many times before. He passed the bread shelf, the soda cooler, the hanging rack of worn travel maps, but never looked at them. He wasn't shopping anymore. The checker seemed to shrink behind the register as the man approached. Not from fear, but from something quieter. Respect, maybe, or relief. The kind that only arrives when someone else carries the authority you thought you had to bear alone. The store owner's face changed the moment he recognized the man. His bravado didn't disappear entirely. Not yet. But it blinked, like a faulty light bulb exposed to full daylight. He opened his mouth as if to explain, but the man in the plain shirt didn't speak yet. He simply walked to the counter, slowly reached into his back pocket, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He flipped it open with one hand, the movement smooth, practiced. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement. The badge caught the overhead light. Not polished, not theatrical, just real. And with it came the silence of consequences. The man's voice, when it came, was calm, even. No drama, just direction. You're lucky all he dropped was an apple. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed like bricks, one at a time, in the silence that followed. The checker's hands trembled slightly as she reached to straighten the receipt spool. The owner's mouth tightened. He gave a short breath through his nose, then crossed his arms. But there was no confidence in it now, only deflection. His weight shifted back a step. The man with the badge didn't advance further. He simply stood where Ben had stood moments before. His height filled the space. His presence replaced what had been stripped away. In every line of his body was the message: this place does not belong to cowards. Outside, the street remained still. No sirens, no crowd. Just the warm sun pushing against the windows and the faint sound of a cane somewhere beyond. Inside, everything was waiting. The officer placed the badge wallet carefully on the counter. Then, without looking at the owner, he bent down and picked up one of the fallen apples from the display near the door. It had rolled farther than the others, a small red thing against gray tile. He brushed it off with one hand, rolled it in his palm for a moment, then set it beside the bread and bills Ben had left. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say sorry. He just nodded once. The kind of nod you give a man you recognize, even if you don't know him by name. The badge stayed visible on the counter. No threats, no report being written, just presence. And for the first time in minutes, the store breathed again. The badge lay still on the counter. It didn't blink or glow, didn't flash with ceremony or sound, but the weight of it had shifted the room. Like a magnet dropped on a map, the air realigned around it. The officer didn't speak again. He didn't need to. He walked, not toward the store owner, but to the far side of the counter, where the old man's cane had landed. It was old wood, scratched but not broken, resting against the cool metal of the lower freezer vent. He crouched to pick it up, brushing dust from its handle. The way he held it, reverent, not hurried, made it seem like something holy. Then, the officer turned. Step by step, he walked out from behind the counter, passing the apples, passing the edge of the bread rack, passing the silent checker and the sullen clerk. No one dared speak. Every motion he made seemed carved from intention, measured, like a flag being raised. When he reached the doorway, he paused. Outside, sunlight spilled across the sidewalk like spilled gold. The breeze carried the scent of nearby pines, and far off, a bird cried out in a single, high arc. But the sound that mattered came from the sidewalk itself, the steady, precise tap, tap, tap of a man returning. Ben was walking back toward the door, bent slightly but tall in a way that age does not erase. His olive cap was once more straight on his head. His shirt had a smear of apple on the hem, and his steps were slower than before. But his eyes, calm, steady, unblinking, had not changed. The officer met him at the threshold. He held the cane out, handle first, with both hands. Not as a handoff, not like returning a lost item, but like offering something sacred. Ben looked at the officer for a long moment. There were no words, just the exchange of memory between men who had both stood beside others in moments when standing mattered more than speaking. Ben took the cane, not with a tremble, but with that same quiet purpose he had carried all morning. He adjusted his grip, pressed it softly against the sidewalk, and turned back toward the interior of the store. The officer did not move away. He walked in beside him. Side by side, they entered, one man from the past, the other from the present, but neither lessened the other. They stood together at the counter now. The badge still lay there. The money was still folded beneath the loaf of bread, and behind them, the aisle that once held mockery now held stillness. The store owner had stepped back. His arms were crossed now, but looser. His face was caught in the middle of a choice. Not yet apology, but no longer defense. The checker was no longer hiding behind her screen. Her hands were flat on the counter. Her eyes followed every movement like someone watching an oath being made. Then, one more thing happened. A man from the back of the store, someone nobody had noticed until now, walked forward and stood just behind the officer. He didn't say anything, didn't raise a fist or take a side. He just stood there. One more body, one more presence. That was the shift. Not noise, not conflict, just a line drawn, made of men and silence and memory. The officer turned only slightly and picked up the loaf of bread. He placed it gently into a paper bag, folded the top, and set it before Ben. Ben reached forward, placed a final coin atop the bag, and tapped it twice with his fingers. Not as a signal, just acknowledgement, and then he turned to leave. The officer followed, not in pursuit, but in rhythm, shoulder to shoulder. The door opened again, and with it, a gust of pine-sweet air filled the space. Nobody cheered. No one clapped, but no one would forget. Outside the door, the sidewalk bathed in gold, but inside the store, the light had shifted in a subtler way. The chill from the coolers no longer felt as harsh. The overhead hum softened, or perhaps the tension had simply drained from the air. Nothing had been resolved, not officially, but the storm had passed, not because it ended, but because the wind had changed direction. Ben Carter stood just beyond the register, his back to the bread display, his cane once again steady in his hand. He hadn't looked at the store owner again, not out of fear, but because the man no longer held his attention. His gaze had settled instead on the officer still beside him, now standing quietly, one hand resting lightly near his sidearm, the other folded across his chest. The badge still lay untouched on the counter. The two men didn't exchange words. They didn't need to. There was a recognition that hung between them like a flag unraised, the kind of bond not forged in conversation, but in shared knowing, the kind that only comes when a man has walked where the other has walked, even if on different soil, in different boots, in different wars. Ben's gaze moved slowly across the store. He didn't linger on the customers, but they watched him. The older gentleman by the newspaper rack straightened his shoulders. The young woman who had been fidgeting in line now held her child a little closer. The teenager with headphones removed one earbud and let it dangle, as though the silence itself was teaching something. And still, Ben did not speak. His eyes returned to the officers. No nod, no handshake, but something passed, as clear as if spoken, as lasting as ink on paper. The checker stepped out from behind her counter, wiping her palms on her apron. She didn't make an announcement. She simply walked over to the apples that had rolled under the cereal shelf and began placing them carefully back into the display, one by one. as if each one deserved care now, as if the weight of those apples had somehow shifted. Behind her, the owner hadn't moved. His hands were now flat on the edge of the counter, his eyes no longer fixed on Ben. They were watching the officer instead, not defiant, but measuring, as if wondering what part of him he had misjudged, or perhaps why he had misjudged it in the first place. A second later, the officer turned. Not fast, not sharp, just a single pivot. His badge still untouched on the counter, the paper bag with Ben's bread still in place. He looked to the clerk, the younger one with the tattoos and the chewing gum. Their eyes met briefly, and something wordless passed between them. A subtle shift, respect unspoken. Ben adjusted his grip on the cane. Then, without ceremony, he walked toward the exit once more. No one blocked his path now. No sound followed his steps. Only the soft tap-tap of wood on tile, steady and certain, like the beat of an old drum long retired, but never silenced. The officer followed him again, a step behind, not as a guard, not as an escort, but as a shadow of acknowledgement. The door opened, and light poured in. This time, warmer. And when the two passed through it, one in old age, the other in quiet authority, the room they left behind remained still, not because of fear, but because dignity had walked through it. The front door clicked shut behind them, but the stillness inside the store didn't break. No beeping scanner, no idle chatter, just the hum of coolers and the sound of questions forming behind silent lips. It was the teenager near the candy aisle who finally spoke. His voice cracked, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he didn't know until now. Was he really in the military? The question wasn't asked to anyone in particular. It floated upward, hung in the space where judgments had just been made and unmade. It could have vanished there, like so many uncomfortable questions do. But instead, the voice that answered it came steady, low, and unmistakably clear. "Yes," the officer said from just beyond the glass door, his hand on the frame, but not yet leaving. "Navy Corpsman, Korea, summer of 1951. A silence deeper than the one before followed that sentence. Because this wasn't speculation anymore. This was fact, lived, earned, worn into the skin of the man they had just watched walk away. He pulled 2 Marines out of a crater under machine gun fire," the officer continued. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. No cover, no rifle, just his hands and a stretcher. Took a bullet through the calf, still finished the job. That scar you might have seen on his temple, shrapnel from the second blast. Never took leave, didn't ask for medals, just came home. No one interrupted, not even the store owner. The clerk with the tattoos had stilled behind the counter. His hand now rested flat on the register, fingers spread. His eyes weren't fixed on the officer anymore. They were scanning the floor, as if trying to reconstruct the moment Ben had been shoved, trying to see it through new eyes. The mother with the child shifted. She lowered her gaze to the small boy in her arms, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead with a sudden tenderness. She didn't speak, but her lips pressed together in a quiet prayer of understanding. The officer looked once through the glass where Ben was crossing the sidewalk at his own pace, cane tapping, shoulders straight. Then he turned back to the room that had just remembered him. "You think men like that just disappear?" the officer asked. Not to accuse, but to remind. "You think their service ends because they stopped marching?" Still no one spoke. The older gentleman who had been flipping through newspapers now lowered one, carefully folding it as if he were closing a story that had come to an ending too soon. His jaw worked, chewing on words he wouldn't say aloud. The checker, no longer chewing gum, reached below the counter, pulled out a small pad of scratch paper and scribbled something. She slid the note beneath the counter. Then she looked to the store owner, whose arms were still crossed, but whose fingers now twitched at his elbows. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked hollow, or maybe unsure. "Why didn't anyone stop it?" the teenager asked again, this time softer. No one answered, but the question hung heavier now, not because there was no answer, but because they all knew what it was. The door hadn't even fully closed behind Officer Hensley before the store's silence broke, not with sound, but with movement. Slow, thoughtful movement. The checker set the notepad aside and stepped out from behind the counter. Her apron shifted with each step as if she were unsure what posture was appropriate now. She looked to the store owner, her eyes waiting for something. Permission, perhaps, or just direction. But he didn't speak. He stood rooted in place, eyes low, his mouth set but without the same edge it had earlier. His fingers curled at his sides as though they were still recalling the shove, still feeling what it cost. It was the older man near the freezer section who moved next. He placed his items back on the shelf with quiet intention. Milk, bread, a packet of gum. Then he walked to the door and looked out through the smudged glass, watching Ben's figure recede slowly down the sidewalk. His hand hovered on the handle but didn't open it. Instead, he turned back toward the counter. "We ought to do better," he said. Not loud, not challenging, just stating what had become truth. The checker exhaled, the kind that sounded like it had waited years to be let out. She walked back behind the counter and picked up a thick marker from the supply drawer. Without asking, she grabbed the paper sign that normally listed daily discounts and flipped it over. Her handwriting was steady, bold. 8:29 a.m. Veteran priority. Service first. She taped it to the counter, then reached for the glass door and pressed a duplicate against the inside, smoothing it down until it clung flat and visible to the street. Still, no applause, no nods, no proud speeches, just change. The mother with the toddler stepped to the counter next. She set down her things and, with a look to the checker, nodded toward the sign. "That's right," she said. "That's the way it should have been." The teenage boy stood in place by the candy rack, eyes bouncing between the door and the new sign. His soda forgotten in one hand, his other balled in a pocket. He didn't speak, but when his father, a man who'd just arrived, still wearing an oil-stained work shirt, asked what was going on, the boy answered with a word he had only just begun to understand. Respect. Behind the register, the owner still hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on the counter, on the $1 bill Benjamin Carter had placed there like it was a farewell letter. Next to it, one apple remained on the floor, bruised but whole. Without a word, he bent down, picked it up, and placed it back in the basket. Then, slowly, he reached beneath the register and pulled out a fresh loaf of bread. Ben's usual. He didn't ring it up. He didn't bag it. He simply walked to the door. Outside, Ben was just reaching the corner. "Mr. Carter," the store owner called. Ben paused, turning slightly. The loaf was held out, not with apology, not with pity, but with both hands, steady and respectful. "This one's on the house, always will be." Ben didn't answer right away. He studied the gesture, as if measuring its weight. Then he nodded once, a movement so small it could have been missed. He took the loaf, tucked it beneath his arm, and walked on. Inside, Officer Hensley hadn't spoken again. He hadn't raised his badge a second time. He didn't need to. His presence had already done its job, not as a symbol of law, but as a reminder of how quickly respect can be forgotten and how quietly it can be restored. By the time he stepped back out into the sun, the signs were already catching the breeze in the front window, their message bold, clear, and newly permanent. The sun had barely lifted above the roof lines when the bell above the door rang again. The same familiar chime, but softer somehow, as if the store itself had remembered what happened here not long ago. It was exactly 8:01 in the morning. Benjamin Carter stepped in with a slow but certain pace. The tip of his cane tapped once for each square of tile beneath him. The motion was careful, not because he was unsure of his footing, but because he treated each step like it meant something. He wore the same olive-green jacket, creased but clean, and the same cap. The faded United States Navy emblem stitched across the front, now sun-bleached at the corners. The checker, now wearing a pin with a small American flag, looked up and smiled. Not just with her lips, but with her eyes. She didn't ask if he needed help. She didn't rush him forward. She simply reached beneath the counter and pulled out a loaf of bread. No price tag, no scan, just readiness. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said softly. The usual. Ben nodded once and stepped up. He looked around the store, not hurried, just observing. There were only 3 other people inside. All of them had stepped slightly to the side as he entered. Not in fear, not in awkwardness, but in silent recognition. Each man had held the door for someone in his life. Today, they held the moment instead. On the counter, Ben placed something before taking his bread. A photograph, creased at the edges yellowed with time. It showed a young sailor, barely 19, standing on the deck of a hospital ship. His uniform was too big for his shoulders. His face, too calm for the war behind him. The signature on the back read, B. Carter, 1951. The checker glanced at it. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered, and she set it carefully against the cash register, where a child in line might see it and one day ask who that man was. From the corner of the store, the bell rang again. A new figure entered, Officer Hensley, not in uniform today. His badge wasn't clipped to his chest, but his posture still carried the quiet command of someone who had walked into the fire before and learned not to blink. He carried 2 coffees, no lids, 1 in each hand. He offered one to Ben. "Still like it black?" he asked, voice low. Ben smiled faintly and took it. Their hands didn't shake. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the paper sign still taped to the door, the one that read, Veteran Priority, 8-9 a.m. It had not been replaced. It had not been torn down. It had been left alone, as if no one dared question its permanence. The store owner stood behind the shelves, watching. He no longer shouted, no longer hovered. He simply made sure the apple bins stayed full and the coffee pot warm. That morning, Ben didn't need to speak much. His cane tapped once on the tile. His bread tucked beneath his arm. The photograph remained at the counter. When he turned to leave, each person in line gave him a clear path. No orders, no gestures, just space. And as the bell chimed again, and he stepped back into the morning light, the warmth in the air seemed to rise just slightly, not from temperature, but from memory, and the store behind him. It wasn't just lit anymore. It felt lived in, like honor had taken root in the floorboards. And for the first time in a long while, it stayed. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.